and thank you for joining us for this book talk. I'm very, very happy to be hosting this event for Dr. Mobasher, my friend and colleague, who is going to talk to us about his latest book, Constitutional Law and the Politics of Ethnic Accommodation in Afghanistan. And you can see here on the PowerPoint. So we have an hour and a half, and let's be very organized so we can make the most out of that event. So my name is Dr. Alexandra Pars, and I teach sociology here in DC at American University with Dr. Mobasher, and I also teach for ALPA. So what we are going to do is in a couple of minutes, I will introduce Dr. Mobasher, but I'm sure you all know already a lot about him. And then Dr. Mobasher will be given 15 minutes to talk about his book. So let's try to keep it within 15 minutes. And then we will talk about the other panelists. So we have three panelists today, Dr. Omar Sadr, Jason Criss Howk, and Professor Tarun Khaitain. I will introduce each of our panelists, and each panelist will have about between 10 and 12 minutes, for to speak about the book and ask questions. After that, we'll come back. And if we have time, I will ask a couple of questions to the panelists and Dr. Mobasher. And if not, we will go directly to the audience who can ask questions. So for the questions, it would be wonderful if you have questions that you put them in the chat, and then I can ask the questions for you. And yeah, that's it. So Dr. Bashir, thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you. So Dr. Bashir is many things. He's teaching sociology at the American University here in Washington. He's also teaching with New York University in the Department of Political Science, and American University of Afghanistan in the Department of Law and Political Science. Dr. Mobasher is also the president of ALPA. He is an expert in comparative constitutional law, identity politics, and human rights, and he has authored numerous articles on constitutional law and identity politics. And his recent projects are also about decentralization and Orientalism, and we've had a lot of discussions about Orientalism. And Dr. Mobasher has a PhD from the University of Washington School of Law. So that's a very brief introduction. So let's just jump into the presentation. The floor is yours, Bashir.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Dr. Alexandra Pars. I am grateful for the panelists, Jason Howk, Dr. Omar Sadr, Dr. Tarun Khaitain, who I've met like after some decades, to join me on this panel. And good morning and good evening to our participants, depending on where you are based right now. So I'll be talking about my book. I've got 15 minutes, so I will try to be as brief as possible. The book is called Constitutional Law and the Politics of Ethnic Accommodation. Has around 8 chapters, so I'm going to just briefly discuss parts of it, and then I will hopefully we'll get some really good comments from questions from the participants, and I'm looking forward to insightful comments and suggestions from the panelists as well. The book, Constitutional Law and the Politics of Ethnic Accommodation, is based on the Constitution of 2004 of Afghanistan and the events afterwards and the impact of the Constitution on ethnic accommodation and what went in Afghanistan. So In this particular presentation, what I'm going to do is basically first I will talk about what do I mean when I say ethnic accommodation and how it's different from how we perceive it in Afghanistan. Secondly, I will talk about the constitutional design and what it has to do with the ethnic accommodation, and I may have some concluding remarks afterwards. So on the first chapter, well, actually, in the introduction of the book, I tried to conceptualize ethnic accommodation because in the context of Afghanistan, usually when we talk about ethnic accommodation, we mean like representation of different ethnic groups, or in shorter phrase, power sharing. And mostly the elites have termed it as if I am in power, then we have ethnic accommodation, but if I'm not in power, then we don't have ethnic accommodation. But in the introduction, I make the argument that it's broader than that, it's more than that, so I will have a brief talk about it. Okay, sorry. I've tried to create a fancy slide. So what do I mean by ethnic accommodation? Yes, it means power sharing, but it means more than that. It also means inclusive laws and policies. So it could be very much possible that you may have representatives of different ethnic groups in the parliament and the cabinet, but still your laws and policies are not equitable, they are not inclusive, they do not represent or reflect the interests and the voices of various communities in Afghanistan. The other aspect of ethnic accommodation is self-governance. In other words, different communities should have some level of autonomous decision-making authority, particularly with regard to their customs, cultures, languages, and religion, and all those things related to those aspects of their lives. And the last part of ethnic accommodation in the context of Afghanistan, but it could be different in other countries, is the institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalitions. Now, when I say power sharing, self-governance, inclusive laws and policies, what do I really mean by that, and how do I measure it in the context of Afghanistan? So looking at power sharing, I looked at two things. First, the representation of ethnic groups in the cabinets of Afghanistan. We had 4 administrations and cabinets, and there were some reshuffles in the cabinets as well. And then we had 3 parliaments in Afghanistan. And I wanted to compare the population of different ethnic groups to their average seats in the cabinet and in the parliament. Unfortunately, we do not have a census of ethnic groups. We only have estimates. Unfortunately, again, different sources gave you different estimates ranging ethnic groups from being majority to minority. So the estimates I used in this particular book is the one that's used by the World Bank, by the United Nations, and by the Election Commission. Is it reliable? I'm not sure about it, but this is the one that has been used regularly in the past 20 years of the Republic. So based on this estimates, Pashtun make between 38 to 44%, Tajiks between 25 to 27%, Hazaras 9 to 19%, Uzbeks between 6 to 9%, and smaller groups between 7 to 15% altogether. Now, if you compare that with their seats in the government, it seems that on average, the cabinets did reflect the population of less or more the population of different ethnic groups. And if you compare their population, their estimated population with their share in the parliament, it's almost the same. The only difference you see is that smaller groups lose their seats in the cabinets from 7% in the first administration to 0% in the last administration. So that was not really equitable and representative of the smaller groups. But on average, you could make the argument that at least partially it was successful. So how about the issue of self-governance? I'm going to make it as short as possible. Based on the Constitution, we had 5 elected local agencies, but really we had only 2 provincial elections, and that was it. Did these provincial councils have any authority? No, they didn't have any authority. They didn't have legal, political, or even administrative authority. based on the Constitution and the subsequent laws, their rule was really advisory. They could only advise the governors what to do and not to do, and that was it, really. And the governor themselves, which is the most important agency in a local government, were actually appointed agencies. In other words, the governors were appointed by the central government rather than elected by the locals. And the problem with that was that mostly the central government appointed a governor that was from a different province. Sometimes they were ethnically, linguistically, and religiously from a different province. Sometimes they didn't know the province. They haven't lived in that particular province that they were assigned to govern and rule. And the locals didn't know the governor. So it was difficult for them to provide a service to a community who didn't know. And even more problematic than that was they didn't have a lot of local loyalty. Local loyalty in the sense that when the Taliban, for example, were advancing across Afghanistan, some of these governors didn't pick up a gun. They didn't even shot a single fire. They just split the province and surrendered, basically surrendered and gave the province to the Taliban. But we had many other locals who were not governors or they weren't part of the government, but they picked up guns and they started establishing some defense, fragmented defense against the Taliban. So they did what the governors needed to do, but because they were so fragmented, they weren't successful either. In terms of inclusive laws and policies, I didn't look at all laws and policies that were passed and implemented in the 20 years of the Republic. I only focused on the ones where different ethnic groups had some sort of a dispute. They wanted different things, like ID cards, higher education law, the power line and things like that. And there were around 21 of them. Now, I wanted to see if the parliament or the president, whoever made the decision with regard to these laws and policies, if these laws and policies favored all disputing ethnic groups or they favored some ethnic groups over other ethnic groups. Overall, these disputed laws favored Pashtuns by 73%, favored the other three larger groups, Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks, by 21 to 22%, and then smaller groups, 66%. And there were only 3 of those disputed decisions with regard to the smaller groups. And then the institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalitions, what we have noticed was there was a large number of cross-ethnic coalitions emerging in the presidential elections, and not many. In fact, there was only one that emerged in the parliamentary election. That was it. But when we are talking about an institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalitions, it's not that these coalitions have to emerge, but also these coalitions have to continue to compete and fight and survive from election to election as an incumbent or as an opposition. But that was not happening for the presidential cross-ethnic coalitions. These coalitions were emerging, and then after the elections, and sometimes even during the elections, they would dissolve, and then there has to be new coalitions in the new presidential election. So really, we were witnessing the emergence of cross-ethnic coalitions, but not the institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalitions. So what the Constitution has to do with all this? Sorry. I'm going to skip this because we don't really have time. So my argument is for cross-ethnic coalition to happen, we need, first of all, an institutional alignment. What do I mean by institutional alignment? Obviously, the Constitution sets up multiple institutions: the electoral systems, the presidential system, the parliament, the power, the checks and balances, and the party system, and the centralization of power. What we need is there has to be some sort of congruence and alignment between all these institutions in terms of ethnic accommodation. You cannot have ethnic accommodation if you have one set of institution promotes it, and then you have other sets of institutions that hinders or towards ethnic accommodation. So just to give you guys an example, I just told you about, why we had multiple cross-ethnic coalitions during the presidential election. The reason was that we had a threshold in the presidential election under the two-round system, which was you have to win over 50% vote in order to become president in Afghanistan. Now, none of the ethnic groups could deliver that 50% vote. And therefore, all candidates have to go to these different communities and encourage them to vote for them and form these cross-ethnic coalitions in order to be able to become the president. And therefore, that threshold encouraged to some extent the development of cross-ethnic coalitions in the presidential election. Why we didn't have it in the parliamentary election? Because we didn't have any such threshold in the parliamentary election. In fact, there were individuals who were able to win parliamentary seats with around 1% of the votes. Now, if you can win with 1% of the votes a seat, you do not need to join a political party. You do not need to form a coalition or join a coalition. In fact, it's sometimes more costly to join a form a coalition rather than to run as an independent candidate. And that's what all these candidates did. Sometimes even party candidates ran as an individual candidate in order to avoid being constrained by the rules of their political parties. So that's why we didn't have a lot of cross-ethnic coalition making happening in the parliamentary elections. And that's why the presidential coalitions couldn't really compete in the parliamentary coalitions. So we had one electoral system promoting cross-ethnic coalition, and then we had another electoral system really discouraging it, and therefore the institutionalization of cross-ethnic coalition couldn't happen. And the other argument I make is that for for ethnic accommodation to happen, you not only need to have inter-institutional alignment, you also need intra-institutional alignment. And by that, I mean different institutions, whether electoral system, whether it's the political system, they have multiple components or multiple subdivisions. And these subdivisions may have their own relationship with ethnic accommodation. What you need to have is the alignment between these sub-institutions. So for example, dual vice presidency, cabinet appointment, legislative power. You need to have the alignment between them, a congruence between them towards ethnic accommodation. Otherwise, you cannot have ethnic accommodation. And that's why you see the same institution has multiple sub-institutions, some of them having like positive relationship. The green lines are the positive relationship. The black lines are the negative relationship between the sub-institutions and ethnic accommodations or various aspects of ethnic accommodation. So to just give you an example, we had inclusive cabinets, as we illustrated earlier, but not inclusive laws. Why? Because based on the Constitution, the cabinet formation decision of the president was subject to the approval of the parliament. In other words, president's cabinet appointees had to get the approval of the parliament. But on the other hand, the legislative authority of the president was broad. And sometimes there were a lot of loopholes within the Constitution that would allow the president to bypass the parliament to make those laws and policies. And therefore, we had inclusive cabinets, but not inclusive laws. And in fact, from the 21 disputed laws and policies, 15 of those laws and policies were decided by the president. From the 6 election laws that had huge impact in the shape and size and weight of the parliament, all 6 of them were actually enacted by the presidential decrees, and the parliament wasn't even involved in those laws. So that could only tell you how imbalanced the relationship between the parliament and the president was, and how that impacted exclusive laws, unequitable laws, and policies in Afghanistan. So and here's my conclusion, just because I would like to hear more from the panelists and get the questions. So the model I offered, I call it the jigsaw puzzle model. What it means is that for ethnic in the jigsaw puzzle, in order to get the full and clear picture, what you need is that all the pieces must fall together, must fit together, and they must fall in the right places. In the same way, in terms of ethnic accommodation in a country, what you need is that all these different sets of institutions and sub-institutions that you designed by the Constitution, they must fit together, they must be in alignment towards ethnic accommodation. Otherwise, you can't have that. And one thing that really I didn't really discuss when I had to talk about the literature review was that the pictures and the shape and the jigsaw puzzle may differ from one country and to other countries. So you may not need the same institution that has worked, for example, in other countries, in Indonesia or Malaysia or other countries that were that had multiple ethnic groups. You may not need the same institutions, but what you need is the alignment between the institutions and sub-institutions in order to get ethnic accommodation. And I think that's the conclusion. So I'm going to end it here just to hear more from the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this very concise. I appreciate you really didn't go over time and thought-provoking presentation. So let's turn to our panelists, and our first panelist is Dr. Omar Sadr. Dr. Sadr is a research associate at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Governments and Markets. And he is also the founding editor-in-chief and host of Negotiating Ideas, an online magazine and podcast on democracy and pluralism. So, Dr. Sadr, you have between 10 and 12 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning to you and the panelists and our audience. It's really an honor to speak about my friend's book, Mobasher, in this panel. I will try to briefly reflect on some of the key strengths of the book and then move on to talk about some of the other issues that were potentially left out from the book. Now, first of all, as someone who has explored cultural diversity and governance challenges in Afghanistan in my own work, I found Bashir's examination of constitutional approaches to ethnic accommodation both timely and significant. Dr. Mobasher's work contributed valuably to our understanding of constitutional frameworks, can either facilitate or embed ethnic accommodation in a deeply divided society. The very first strength of the book is, I think, the theoretical framework. He skillfully bridges the constitutional design theory with practical realities of ethnic politics in Afghanistan. The book's integration of legal formalism with political pragmatism offers a refreshing departure from purely legalistic analysis of constitutions in a pluralistic society. And he, as he mentioned here today in his talk, he tries to argue that in order to have ethnic accommodation, a political system